All right. Hey, everyone. It's top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and jump on in. Just do a quick sound check here. Want to make sure everyone can hear me and everyone knows where to type in their answers. We're going to be very interactive today, so want to make sure we're all good on how to do that. If you go to the questions tab, all right, I'm seeing responses, so that's a good sign. Ooh, we've got some people from Portland, Oregon. Someone says hi from Portland. Very exciting. All right, so let's go ahead and jump on in. So before we get started, just want to introduce myself. I know several people on the webinar today are on my e-newsletter list and may have seen me speak or heard other webinars I've done. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Mattice-Sundell, and I just want to share my story a little bit because it really informs my point of view, and you'll hear a lot of my story coming throughout the webinar. So over a decade ago, I was a director of HR for a nonprofit organization and found myself working with a bully. And this person was an uber excessive micromanager. He yelled, he made life very uncomfortable. And as the director of HR, I dealt with all of the problems that he created, spent a lot of time hiring people into his department and then seeing them off when they realized who they were working for. And then I'd have to hire new people in. So lots of turnover. And then I personally felt bullied by this individual. So in addition to the organizational problems he created, I experienced the problems that he was creating for the individuals in the organization. Well, during this time, I started getting my master's degree and ended up having a class called The Dark Side of Communication, where we were learning about all things dark in human interaction. And of course, I had to write a paper on something dark. And so I decided to write a paper on my situation at work. And it was during that time that I came across the phrase workplace bullying and have been obsessed with that topic ever since. After I got out of graduate school, I started Civility Partners. So we are an HR consulting firm, and we partner with organizations to help them create positive work environments. But at the beginning of my career at Civility Partners, I really kind of went through this paradigm shift where I started to realize that in my efforts to solve the problem of workplace bullying and harassment, that what I was really doing was replacing those behaviors with positive ones. I was teaching the organization how to create a culture that didn't allow bullying to happen, and teaching people how to engage in more positive communication. And so my ultimate opinion is that the ultimate solution to things like harassment and workplace bullying and any negative behavior really is having a positive work environment, a workplace culture. So that's what we're going to talk about today in this webinar. Over the course of having Civility Partners and doing all this, I've been fortunate enough to be cited as an expert in quite a few very cool places. I'm a regular contributor to Forbes, and we've also served a huge array of clients ranging from Fortune 500s on down to a tiny little community business in the middle of nowhere, and everything in between. So I've seen it all and experienced a lot of different scenarios given all of these different industries that we've worked in. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Just want to point out that, and you probably know this already, 75% of people who feel harassed at work never report it. And that number, 75%, comes from two separate research studies, one done by the EEOC a few years ago, one done by SHRM recently. Both found separately 75% of people who feel harassed at work never report it. So we have to ask ourselves why. And of course, we can jump to the easy answer. Well, there are fears of retaliation. And so, that makes sense. People are afraid to report it. They don't know what's going to happen if they report harassment. Is the harasser going to retaliate against them? Is the organization going to retaliate? Who knows? So that is a very real fear. But I don't want us to, or we shouldn't just stop there. I think a lot of times people just sort of say, well, they're afraid of retaliation. At my organization, we have a policy and people know who to report harassment to. So that's not the issue at my organization. But I think we have to look deeper at what people are afraid of. So let's talk about the communication at the workplace. So if you think about it, at work, we are under pressure to speak logically. We're under pressure to provide solutions, to talk about plans of action, to work as a team. So everything we do at work is around, actions, communicating about goals. And if somebody's going to talk about being harassed at work, then they're going against the normal type of communication that we're having at work, right? So it's not just that they're afraid of retaliation. If somebody's to report harassment, they're going against the grain in terms of how you talk at work. So there's this social nuance there that prevents people from reporting harassment. Another example of a social nuance, and of course there are many, is something called muted group theory. So I don't want to get too political on you, but just to talk about this for a second, muted group theory is the idea that there is a more powerful culture and a less powerful culture. And you can look at a variety of different ways this might unfold. But at work, when it comes to gender, we could say that males are not the muted group and females are. So again, I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking politics here, but it's no secret that women make less money. Women have a glass ceiling, all this kind of stuff. So what I'm saying is that when women talk about being harassed at work, they're talking about it using male language. They're talking about it in a world of men. And so muted group theory is another example of the social nuances that keep people from reporting harassment. Another example is your own organization's culture. So let's talk about that for a second. So allowing legal behaviors such as incivility and bullying actually discourages people from speaking up when harassment happens. So if you're not addressing other bad behaviors that are unrelated to harassment, you maybe have bullying or some incivility or unprofessionalism, all of that's legal. It's your prerogative not to step in. But if you don't step in, it becomes part of the culture. So your organization's culture in and of itself is preventing people from reporting harassment. On the flip side, a workplace culture that promotes respect and civility encourages people to speak up for themselves and for others, or report it to the right channels when harassment happens. So your organization's culture literally may be preventing people from talking about harassment, and it may actually be encouraging harassment ultimately. So in this webinar, we're going to essentially look at harassment in a new way. I want to help you see harassment differently. And then we'll ultimately talk about a bunch of steps. I'm going to give you 10 steps for using your culture to put a stop to harassment. And I'll just say this ain't your typical sexual harassment webinar. I am not going to talk about updating your policy and what belongs in your policy. And I'm not going to talk about California AB 1825 and tell you, what's supposed to be covered and who's supposed to do the training. You know all that stuff. That's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about culture. So let's test your knowledge, or just kind of see where we're feeling. You've got a bunch of words there on your screen. What do these words mean? How are these words related or not? So just give me a couple thoughts on what do you think about these words? How are they related? What do they mean? What's the difference? Pick a word or two. Let's get some interaction going. What are your thoughts? Okay, someone says one thing they have in common is that they're all problematic. That is for sure. What else? That they're all negative, sure. What else? Some are condoned and others may not be. They create a hostile work environment. Bullying is the most difficult to repair. All carry a legal risk. They're on a continuum, that's right. Could be an individual or a group. They're all a lawsuit waiting to happen. Let's see, they're uncomfortable to talk about, that's right. Some are legal, some are illegal. Harmful to the person at the receiving end, absolutely. Some have legal definitions, some don't. Okay, perfect. So Thank you for doing that. So what I want to do is talk you through these different words, and they are absolutely on a spectrum. So let's just take a look at how these behaviors are all related to one another. So incivility and unprofessionalism are about microaggressions, right? So incivility, the definition of incivility is microaggressions. Unprofessionalism, the definition of that are microaggressions that go outside the norms of the profession that you're in. Incivility and unprofessionalism are certainly not illegal. It's your prerogative as an organization to allow them to happen. But the problem is if you allow them to happen, then they start to bleed into other parts of the organization. They could turn into something like bullying. And they are more damaging than you may realize. So for example, Christine Porath, who is the queen of incivility research and has published quite a bit in the Harvard Business Review, she has found that somebody at the receiving end of an uncivil interaction actually admits that they spend the rest of their workday thinking about it and being distracted by it. She found that 80% of her respondents in a survey that she did admitted that their loyalty to the organization dropped when people felt like the organization was allowing these behaviors to happen. So, do we yell fire when there's incivility? No, but they are causing damage. And again, if allowed to flourish, then this behavior can turn into bullying. Bullying is about repeated aggressive communication, humiliation, and manipulation. And, just to share a few examples, one individual that I coached for his bullying behaviors, one thing that he would do is sort of stand up in staff meetings and lean over the table, and his eyes would get all bulgy, and he'd make some rude comment, and then he'd sit back down. So if he does that one time, maybe that's incivility and unprofessionalism. But if he's doing that all the time, in addition to yelling at people, sending nasty emails, ignoring people, manipulating their workload, then it certainly becomes bullying. I see a question there. Can I repeat the name of the researcher? Yes, the incivility researcher is Christine Porath, P-O-R-A-T-H. And if you just type in her name in Harvard Business Review, you'll find several of her articles there. Okay, so let's talk about conflict. So I put conflict sort of in this realm in between incivility and bullying. Conflict happens when you have two people who disagree, but they both feel heard. Bullying happens when you have one person squashing out the voice of the other person. So bullying is about abuse of power and psychological abuse, essentially, whereas conflict is more about equal parties having differences of opinion, but they both feel that they're able to share their opinions. Conflict can certainly turn into bullying if over the course of conflict, one person sort of rises above in power. So the next list of behaviors there are discrimination, harassment, mobbing, and hazing. So in the world of workplace bullying, we like to say that bullying is the overarching behavior, and that something like harassment is a subset of bullying. So I'd love for you to write this down. Get out a piece of paper and a pen and write this down. Are you ready? Bullying and harassment are the same behaviors. Bullying and harassment are the same behaviors. The only thing that makes them different is who they're aimed at and whether or not they're illegal or not. So I will give you a quick rundown on that in a moment, but harassment and bullying are the same behaviors. Mobbing happens when you have a group of people bullying one person. Hazing happens when you have a group of people bullying one person. The difference being that hazing has a timestamp on it. Hazing is about indoctrinating someone into your workplace, and once the group feels that that person's been indoctrinated, then they'll lay off on the hazing. But mobbing and hazing are both about sort of group bullying. Next up on the spectrum there is workplace violence. So I'll say this, bullying actually is a form of workplace violence. So I hope you'll write that down as well. Bullying is a form of workplace violence. So if you look at OSHA's website, for example, OSHA says that verbal threats count as workplace violence, and I've met plenty of people who engage in workplace bullying who are doing that, so they're crossing into violence. Another example, using that individual that I coached as an example, one of the things that caused the organization to seek me out to coach him was that he'd always yelled. He'd been yelling like crazy for years, but he yelled so sort of crazily at somebody that this individual said that they had a panic attack, and literally his tongue was swelling up, and he told his buddies at work that had he needed to run, he would not have been able to. He felt that his feet were sort of planted on the ground. He was frozen and his tongue was swelling. He was sweaty and his heart was beating. And so the fact that he had a panic attack is what caused the organization to say, whoa, you can't yell like that anymore. We're going to get you a coach. But you can see how easily that crosses to violence. All right. Any questions actually on this? Let's go back to this. Any thoughts on this or questions? What do you think? Where are we at? How are we feeling? Someone says this is all making sense. Understanding. Will you be talking about microaggressions? I am not necessarily going to specifically hone in on microaggressions, but again, incivility is microaggression. That's the definition of incivility. So incivility or microaggressions can certainly turn into bullying. Repeat the difference between bullying and harassment. Monique, I'm about to do that for you. We will talk through harassment and bullying on the next slide, so hang on. Is there a differentiation in your view between bullying and abrasive behaviors? Heather, I'd say no. So I coach people who engage in workplace bullying, and we actually call them abrasive leaders in that scenario because it's a little more polite. So I sort of advertise that I coach abrasive leaders. So no, I think abrasiveness is a bullying behavior, absolutely. What do you do if it's a small office and the violator is the sole proprietor? Let's talk offline on that. I've got some advice for you. I will give you an email address for the person who asked that. I don't want to say your name. Do you have recommendations for courses or books that have more detail on these things? Yeah, actually, I've written a couple books, so we can get that information to you as well. So one book is called Back Off, and one is called Seeking Civility. Where are we located? We're in San Diego. All right, so let's keep moving forward, and we'll come back to some of those questions. Will I touch on shunning as harassment bullying? Yes, so shunning is absolutely a form of bullying behaviors and harassment, 100%. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how harassment and bullying compare. So both of these behaviors are about abuse of power. So what's interesting is that in the law, harassment never talks about abuse of power. So that's not in the definition. You don't have to prove there was abuse of power to prove that there was harassment. But any article out there on the topic of sexual harassment or harassment really talks about abuse of power. So it's part of the social aspect of harassment that we're aware of, but it's not part of the legal definition. But interestingly, the few states out there that have laws around bullying use abuse of power as part of the definition. So I find that fascinating that although the behaviors are the same, we talk about them differently. But in the end, this is something they have in common. Both of these behaviors are about power abuse. Next up is this, these behaviors are both repeated. So harassment generally has to be repeated and ongoing unless it's one egregious act. And same with bullying. It has to be ongoing and repeated unless it's one egregious act. Both of these behaviors, when we talk about intent, we could say it was irrelevant. So with harassment, for example, again, the law never talks about intent. You don't have to prove it was intentional to prove that harassment happened. In fact, most corporate policies will say that these behaviors are prohibited, whether intentional or not. With bullying, it's a little more up in the air. So as a person who coaches workplace bullies or abrasive leaders, and as someone who has been studying this topic for over a decade, I will tell you that there is not a lot of proof that there is intention. People who engage in workplace bullying are actually lacking social and emotional intelligence, and they're really driven by a desire to be seen as competent. So they're not actually doing it to make people hurt. That's not the reasoning behind it. If you are being bullied, it's easy to feel that way, but that's not the case. Next up, both of these behaviors ruin lives. So people who are at the receiving end of harassment of any kind are obviously psychologically damaged by this. It's hurtful and painful. And if they do report it, they end up going through a court case and all of this stuff. It's hard. People who report harassment can lose their jobs. It can be hard to get another job. And same with bullying. Lots of research on the damage bullying causes. Bullying can cause people to get PTSD. I've personally experienced 2 phone calls with HR professionals who'd had a suicide because of the bullying. Lots of research that people who are at the receiving end of this behavior are anxious and depressed and have health problems as a result of all of that. So lastly, really and truly, the only difference between these two things is that harassment is illegal and bullying is legal. So if you bully somebody because of their race, religion, age, etc., we say that violates their civil rights, that's harassment and that's illegal. But if you bully everyone, then that's bullying. It does not violate civil rights and therefore it's legal. So it's really interesting because I get these calls from organizations all the time. They have one person who's, bullying everybody, yelling at everyone all the time, and these people are kind of saying, well, what do I do? The answer is the same thing you'd do if there was harassment, right? You have to step in and solve it. So just to put this in perspective, I put together this little slide for you. So the guy at the top is engaging in harassment. He's yelling at one person. She could theoretically go to HR and say, I'm young and I'm Asian. That's harassment. He's not picking on anybody else. So it must be because I'm young, I'm a woman, I'm Asian. Pick a category, that's harassment. If he engages in the same behaviors and aims at everyone, then it's not harassment, it's legal. It just boggles my mind. It's fascinating. All right, so let's talk about how this all works as a social phenomenon. So something else I see in conversations around harassment are that it's really always focused on the harasser and the target. The harasser and the target. And so we talk about it as if it's in a vacuum. And that's why we're saying, well, if we have a policy and do training, that'll fix it because it's just those two people. But it's a social phenomenon. So let's talk about the perpetrator. People who engage in harassing and bullying behaviors are lacking social and emotional intelligence. They probably learned the behavior somewhere along the way. They have a strong desire to be seen as uber competent, and anybody or anything that threatens that ability to be perceived as uber competent, they lash out at. They are bad communicators. They don't deal with stress very well. So those are some of the characteristics that people who engage in harassment and bullying have. But then we have the target. And so I'm certainly not suggesting that targets deserve anything that happens to them, but they do play a role, right? We're not innocent passerbys in our own life. So people who are at the receiving end of these behaviors may not have been speaking up for themselves when the behaviors initially began to start. So perhaps had they stepped in right away and said, hey, I didn't like what you said yesterday at that meeting, they may have been able to put a stop to the behavior. And targets are also often very high performers. So targets are often seen as, or they're doing well, and so they threaten the perpetrator's ability to be seen as competent. I've seen maybe 3 or 4 questions about getting the slides, and the answer is no. You'll be able to watch the recording, but we're not going to be sending out the slides. Okay, so power imbalance is the nature of the relationship between the perpetrator and the target. As we said, both of these behaviors are about abuse of power. But we can't forget the organizational members. So again, this is not happening in a vacuum. So you have a group of people who watch these behaviors happen. They are well aware that harassment is going on. They are well aware that bullying is going on, and they're not saying anything about it. So when they watch bullying happening in a staff meeting, they don't speak up in the staff meeting to protect the target, and they're not going to managers, and they're not going to HR. And when the target says, hey, you've witnessed these behaviors, will you come with me to HR? Most people say no. And it makes sense. Of course they say no. They don't want to be part of it. They don't want to be attacked. They don't want to be next in line. They also fear retaliation. But what happens is these people are not witnesses. They're not bystanders, they're reinforcers. So they are making a conscious choice not to be involved, and that makes them a reinforcer. So by reinforcing the behavior, they're supporting the perpetrator and they're damaging the target. And on the other side, we have the organization itself. So again, your culture plays a role in whether or not harassment and bullying is happening. Someone just said, this is very powerful stuff. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. The organization itself is playing a role in this. So your culture, is part of the problem. And that's why when I talk about harassment prevention, I talk about it from a culture standpoint. Yes, you have to have a policy and you have to do harassment training, but we got to go way, way past that if you're really going to prevent harassment, right? So what are some of the cultural factors? Well, if your organization is highly competitive, if you have a lot of people who have been there for a long time, that can facilitate bullying and harassment. If you have very smart people in your organization, for example, lawyers, doctors, engineers, you have the opportunity for harassment and bullying to flourish. If you have an organization going through change, that tends to make people lash out and become aggressive. Maybe your leaders are like that. I've coached a few people who kind of said, well, the C-suite's like that, so that's how I am, if you have an organization that's bureaucratic with a lot of rules and regulations, that makes it possible for bullying and harassment to flourish. So again, there's a lot of cultural factors. So what I'm saying is your culture is supporting harassment and bullying and damaging the target and making it impossible for them to speak up and protect themselves. Meanwhile, the perpetrator is damaging the organizational members and damaging the organization itself. So again, people who are at the receiving end of these behaviors are anxious, afraid, depressed. They're not sleeping, they're not eating. Heart disease has been attached to workplace bullying, PTSD, and of course that means that your customer service is down, your morale is down, your productivity is down. This is expensive. All right, so if you allow these negative behaviors to thrive, what happens is you're sending the message to your employees that you don't care about behavior. People will not come forward when bad behavior happens. You are definitely at risk for litigation because employees don't distinguish between a hostile work environment related to harassment and a hostile work environment related to workplace bullying. So you're at risk for litigation. And again, turnover is up and productivity goes down. Contrast that with this beautiful quote by Johnny Taylor, who has just recently become the SHRM's CEO. And one of the things that he talked about when he was in front of the California legislature was that, he was talking about how the legislature can attack sexual harassment within California's government. And so he said this beautiful thing: with a healthy workplace culture, when sexual harassment is observed or experienced, the community takes over and shuts it down collectively with a message that this behavior will not be tolerated here by anyone at any level. So I love that he was in front of the California legislators saying, stop trying to create laws around congressmen, dating their interns, because people will just figure out ways to go around the laws. What you have to do instead is create a culture that prohibits it so that people step in. So it's not about the law. So we have gotten so focused on policy and laws around harassment that we have lost the emotional part of harassment and the culture part and the social nuances that go into harassment and how to prevent it. So just to put this in perspective for you, this is Johnny Taylor's quote highlighted for you. Literally, when you have a positive workplace culture, if somebody starts to act up and go against the norm, everybody else will surround that person and say, hey, you can't act like that, right? So again, where we've gotten so far with harassment is every article out there online is talking about policy training, and somehow that's supposed to change your culture. That's wrong. That's wrong. All that policy and training does is make sure that you're checking a box. You checked your compliance box. We have our policy. We're good to go. And all that happens in your training is that you have somebody talking about what the law says about harassment, and they're talking about here, here's how the law defines harassment, and here's some examples of that happening. That's not useful, as we know, because harassment complaints are going up, not down. So it's what we're doing is not working. We have to look at harassment in a new way, right? So what I would say is that in order to change the organization's culture, you have to change leadership's point of view. You have to have policies and procedures in place to support your culture, but really you have to focus on behavior change. You have to push on behavior, and you're not going to do that with a policy, and you're not going to do that with a training that's focused on the law. So just curious, how are we feeling so far? Where you agreeing with me? You feeling like I'm on the right track? Any thoughts or comments? I'm in California. How do you get leadership on board when they already require training on sexual harassment? That's a great question. So I think it's HR's job to go to leadership and say, hey, look, we have to have training. It's required by the law. Yes, but that's not minimizing our risk. All it's doing is proving that we did something we were supposed to do. It's not reducing risk. So if your CEO and your C-suite is focused on harassment prevention, then it's your job as HR to educate those people and say, look, harassment prevention is about culture. You want to make sure there is not harassment. We have to create a culture that doesn't allow for it to happen. Someone says we are on the right track with our training, so that's good. Kudos to you. I'm seeing love it, awesome, Uber 101, indeed. All right, so let's talk about some steps, some tips. So yes, you do need to do training. I realize in California we've got AB 1825. You have to do training, of course, but I'm asking you to consider adjusting it. So I think a big part of training that's really missing these days are trainings around positive behaviors, trainings around bystander responsibilities, and accountability. So for example, in California, if you have a lawyer come in and do your harassment training because that's what you're supposed to do, it's likely that this lawyer is only barely scratching the surface on what positive, respectful behaviors look like, because they're focused on the liability part of harassment. They're probably not necessarily talking about bystander responsibilities, and they're probably not talking about accountability, right? So you have to add to the training that they do. And in fact, we've paired up with a pretty big law firm here in San Diego, where the attorney does the 2-hour mandatory, and then I do an hour. So the training is now 3 hours. And that last hour is around these sorts of topics. So it becomes more powerful. So then the training's about, here's the law and what you're not supposed to do and sort of how to protect yourself from the law. But here's the real prevention around, creating a culture that does not allow this to happen. So let's see, we have a question. My company only provides harassment training to management and doesn't review it with employees. Would that be your recommendation? Absolutely. Managers and supervisors need training, but so do employees. I think the bystander aspect is key to hold all employees accountable, not just leadership. We tend to blame leadership and they may not even see it. That's right. Plaintiff side lawyers are doing the bystander responsibility and not just the law. Perfect. Glad to hear it. based on the old task force report. Great to hear it. So what I'm saying, and I've seen this in some of the articles out there on advice, that, you know, you're supposed to create a see something, say something culture. You know, I've seen that out there when people are giving advice, but the way to create that culture is, again, through culture change. That, again, it's not, hey, everyone, we'd like to have a see something, say something culture, and then that's all you do. It has to be training on, you know, what are you looking for when you're seeing something, and how do you say something, and are people expected to step in, you know, in the moment? Are they expected to tell HR? What does say something look like? So you have to do training on these topics, and what does see something, say something look like? I got another question. Do you do different training for employees in leadership? Yes, we do. So whenever I do training, it's a 2-hour training for everybody, the entire organization, and then an additional training for managers and supervisors only. It's difficult to train everyone in an organization when there's 5,000 employees. Good point. But then we're back to culture. How important is culture to you? You know, so yeah, it could be difficult and probably expensive, but how important is it to you to create an environment where people are happy and healthy and thriving, right? So you got to weigh that. Does method of training have an impact is another question here. I believe so. I think online training is really popular for sexual harassment training because it's check the box. We have to make sure everybody watches it. So that's a way to do that. But I think, again, all that does is focus on the law. If you want the training to have impact, you have to have conversations in the training around the nuances of harassment. You need people to hear from each other about harassment. So I think your training is going to have way more impact if people have the opportunity to talk about their experiences with sexual harassment, as minor as they might be. They're important to the conversation. Actually, just to give you an example of that, so I spoke at a conference for Vistage, which is a CEO professional association, and I gave a talk on sexual harassment and how to prevent it to this room of CEOs. And one of the CEOs raises his hand and he says, you know, in my organization, you know, we have this feeling that this is a big organization, a big company problem. We're a small company. How do I talk people into, you know, sort of being interested in resolving this problem when they see it as a big problem for big organizations, and it doesn't happen here? And another CEO stands up out of her chair and she's like, that is BS. Every woman, every daughter, every mother, every woman in your life that you've ever met has an experience with sexual harassment, and you have to give them the opportunity to share that. And so it was just a cool conversation. So bottom line is that in-person training allows the opportunity for people to talk about their experiences, which ultimately creates empathy, which is what you need in your culture, right? Okay, so I think everyone in your organization, beyond training on harassment, needs training on positive skills. They need training on communication skills, leadership, collaboration, respect, giving each other feedback, how to celebrate, how to be a part of the culture, and also assertiveness. Every single person in your organization has to know how to step in when they witness something that's not okay. In addition, your leaders and managers need training on how to set expectations with employees about behavior. They need training on managing incivility all the way up to bullying and harassment. They need to know how to coach behavior in addition to coaching performance. And they need to have training in how to create a positive culture inside their own team. So that, you know, that's what my trainings are about. How do you create a culture inside your own work team that prevents harassment and bullying? All right, idea number 2, action item number 2. I recommend doing a climate assessment. So I'm just curious to hear from you. How many of you have done a climate assessment as a result of all of the sexual harassment attention in the media? Did anybody think, gosh, we better see if our climate is allowing that to happen? I'm seeing several no's. Anybody want to say yes? Anybody do it? So here's the thing. Someone said, no, but it's a good idea. Indeed. So, if you're worried about harassment prevention and that's something that's on your mind and something that's on your C-suite's mind, a great place to start is to understand, does our organization have a culture that facilitates harassment and bullying? And someone says no, where would we come up with the questions? You know what, Christina, we do that. We have several questions that we would ask in a situation like that. So I'm not gonna how to create a survey around that maybe goes beyond the scope of this webinar, but let's talk. We can certainly talk, and I'll give you some contact information at the end. Someone asked for a score after our recent training. Okay, so Suzanne, you did a training and then kind of asked, are we opening, is our culture facilitating harassment or not? I'm sure you said it in a more PC kind of a way. Okay. Someone else says we did, and then we ended up terming a bad supervisor. Good job. Good on ya. Someone did a limited basis survey with a few different departments with multiple complaints. Okay. Do you do specific work on how managers, leaders deal with their own discomfort of conflict? How this may be their barrier to creating the change necessary or addressing the matter? Yeah, so managers and leaders have to step in and address culture in their team, right? So if they're not able to do that because of their own discomfort, then just like anything else, you have to teach them how to overcome their discomfort. So if you have a leader of a sales team and he or she is not able to help the sales meet their quota, that's a problem. And you would address that and you would give them coaching and hopefully they can change or they're out. And the same goes for this skill. It's the same scenario. To be a leader in a positive culture, they have to know how to do it and they have to get past their own discomfort. Someone else asked, would a climate assessment be considered an engagement survey? The answer is no. So employee engagement is about whether or not employees are giving their maximum effort all the time, right? Whether or not they're happy at work. Climate is asking other questions around your culture specifically. So certainly there is some crossover in questions, but they are not one and the same. Okay, so action item number 3 is to hold managers accountable to the positive climate survey scores. So just back to my question that was just asked that I was talking about there. You do climate assessment. You can see department by department how the climate is, and you can hold your managers accountable to receiving a certain kind of a score. Again, just like you would hold a sales manager accountable to a quota. It has to be a skill that your managers have if you're going to do the ultimate harassment prevention. So that means you have to train and require your managers to create action items around core values and around your culture. Just to give you some examples of what that might look like. You could do this right after this webinar. Send an email out to your managers and ask them to sort of audit their practices against your core values. Asking, just have the managers meet with their team and have a conversation around your core values and then sort of ask, is there anything we're doing that goes against these core values? For example, maybe diversity is one of your core values. And in this conversation, the manager realizes that there isn't any diversity in their department. That would be an example of them going against your core values and needing to remedy that. Another example might be to create lunch and learns around core values. So I love this idea, just asking each department to kind of create a short training, a 30-minute training around one of your core values. And so the accounting department's giving a training on, customer service, and the customer service department is giving a training on accountability or whatever it is. It's just a way to keep the conversation going. Another example might be, holding spirit days to celebrate your values. So obviously these 3 action items in and of themselves don't change your culture, right? They're not going to prevent harassment. But what I'm saying is that there is a series of steps, a series of actions, small and big, that go into culture change. And the more your managers are talking about and working with their staff on a positive work environment, the more your culture is going to change. So managers, again, have to be held accountable to having the right kind of environment in their own departments. All right, pause here. I got a couple of questions. What are the plausible assumptions as seen in harassment presently, and how are they defined? Is this generally men to women? I asked this based on experiences where several females were sexually harassed by other females. Yeah, absolutely. So sexual harassment can be female to male, it can be male to female, it can be female to female, male to male. I just wrote an online course actually for an online training program. They asked me to write their sexual harassment program for them, and one of the sort of examples I gave in there was a kid in a music store who's a guy, but dyes his hair pink and has jewelry and kind of dresses in what society would consider a feminine way, and another employee who's a male is sort of picking on him and asking him if he's are you a girl and all that kind of stuff. That's sexual harassment. So it doesn't have to necessarily be sexual in nature that you get a promotion if you have a date with me. It's anything related to sex and gender. Okay, action item number 4, you got to regularly reward exemplary behavior. So when employees do the right things and engage in the right kinds of behaviors, then you're going to reward them. And again, simple ways. It doesn't have to be a big giant budget, but the idea being that every single time an employee does something right, they should be acknowledged for that, even if it's just a simple thank you from the manager. Hey, I noticed yesterday that you stepped in when somebody made an inappropriate comment. Thanks for doing that. So just acknowledging every single time somebody does the right thing. Action item number 5 is to actively create equity. So I told you this is not going to be a standard sexual harassment webinar. So I'm curious to know how many of you thought about sexual harassment as sort of an inequity or something that's creating inequality, and did you take any action steps towards creating more equality in your organization? For example, did you take a look at your pay? Did you take a look at diversity? Did you take a look at your recruiting practices to make sure you're recruiting from lots of different community groups? So again, we're talking about harassment prevention from a cultural standpoint. You can't prevent harassment or say that you care about harassment if women make less than men for the same job. So we have to look past training and policy. We have to look at the culture. Action item number 6, bring your core values to life. So this is a mistake I see from a lot of my clients. The clients call, our culture's out of hand, can you please help us? And one constant that I see is that the reason their culture is out of hand is they've lost control of their core values. They compromise their core values, and their core values no longer matter. And so people aren't acting in ways that are aligned with the core values. So that means that you have to require and empower employees to live your core values. And I would also recommend adding your core values to your strategic plan. So your organization has a strategic plan about customer growth, expanding locations, new marketing ideas. You got to add culture. Culture should be a line item in your strategic plan. Let me give you an example of a company that empowers and requires its employees to live their core values. And you may have heard this story from me before. I've used it a few times as an example because it's a great story. So I am a LinkedIn Learning course author. That's me. The very first time I did a course a few years ago with the producer and all of the people in the room that worked with me on it. And I love going to LinkedIn Learning's campus. It's up in Santa Barbara. I love going there. They have a great work environment. And so the way it works is I write the course here at my desk in San Diego, and once it's all approved, I go to the campus to film the course. So LinkedIn Learning's, their campus has all kinds of strangers on it, people just like me from the outside who come on the campus for a few days to work with them. And naturally, not everybody's going to fit into LinkedIn Learning's culture. So I've heard this story from two separate employees. They had their own version of this story, but what was interesting about it is they both took the same action. So these two different women, two different separate scenarios, were working with an author who came on campus, and both times this author was a male, two different male authors made some inappropriate comments to both of these women, and both of these women initially said, please, don't make those comments, it's inappropriate. The comments continued, and both of these women asked the author to leave and said, you know what, I don't have to work with you. I don't want to work with you. I'm asking you to leave. And we'll just spend the money on hiring a new author. No harm, no foul. You're done. We're not working with you anymore. LinkedIn Learning's, one of their core values is act like an owner. So what's happened is LinkedIn Learning has said, this is our core value, act like an owner. And yes, it's a poster on the wall. I see all of their core values all over the place on campus. But these two ladies actually, in fact, acted like an owner. They made an owner decision. They did not have to go through any sort of channel. They were able to say, I'm protecting myself. I don't want to work with you. You're out, which is what an owner would do. And so you have to ask yourself, if you look at your core values, are your employees empowered and required to live the core values or not? Are they just words on paper? And if you have a core value such as act like an owner, which is a trendy core value these days, do your employees actually act like owners, or are you just referring to accountability? So your core values are a huge part of your culture, and I'm positive that none of your core values allow for harassment and bullying and incivility even, or microaggressions. So, you have to protect your core values because they dictate your culture. So I'm just curious, how many of you know your core values and are really living them there at your workplace? I'll get off my soapbox now while you answer the question. One person says, I do. Let's get some answers. Who knows their core values? We have 7. It's hard to remember all of them. Okay. I might recommend cutting back or making the words more profound and emotional. Let's see. Someone else says, not too sure how on earth we could implement this, act like an owner in the hierarchy, such as the government. Yeah, you may not be able to make act like an owner one of your core values, but you can create core values that speak to your own workplace, right? We have some, but they're on paper only. Someone says we have 10. Someone says we do have core values, but we need to improve and show action. I'll surely throw this out there. Someone else says I do. Perfect. So 5 core values, they're embedded in everyday work. Perfect. That's what we like to hear. Someone else says no one knows what our values are. Okay, so it's just fascinating. Your leadership created your vision, your mission, and your core values long ago, probably because they thought they were supposed to, and then they haven't done anything with them. But you really and truly can use them to prevent harassment. Okay. Let's talk about action item number 7, which is to address all negative behavior, even behavior that's legal. So again, if you allow incivility, bullying, some of these other behaviors to happen, you're not preventing harassment. You're allowing harassment, and you're making it hard on employees to speak up. So I want to talk about this a little bit. I'll just say that, the sooner you can step into someone's bad behavior, it's easier to step in the sooner you do it, and it prevents the future damage. So we hate when we get calls in from HR and they say, we've had this problem for 5 years and we haven't been able to fix it. I mean, that's lots of money out the window, lots of wasted time, lots of turnover, lots of room for bad reviews on Glassdoor. Why wait that long? Step in early. And I'll just say this too, any kind of bad behavior, whether it's microaggression or incivility or bullying or anything, that's a performance problem, and it needs to be addressed as such. So somebody's not meeting a quota, someone's showing up late, someone's work isn't very good, you would step in all of those scenarios and have a conversation with them Same goes for any sort of bad behavior that goes against your core values. So not to worry, I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. So your job is to make this person see, make this person care, and get them help. So if you have somebody engaging in behavior that goes against your core values or goes against your culture, make them see, make them care, and get them help. So I'll just say this before I dive into those three steps. A lot of people assume that people who engage in negative behaviors are doing it intentionally, that they are fully aware of the damage that they're causing and that they can't change. The reality is that these behaviors are very unintentional, as I mentioned earlier, that people are fully unaware of the damage that they're causing, and they absolutely can change. So I do hear a lot people say, you know, we haven't stepped in because we're not sure they can change. They've been acting that way forever. That's not a reason. You know, you have to step in, let them know what's going on, and give them the opportunity to do that. So in terms of making them see, here's the script for you. We've had a steady stream of complaints from coworkers about their experiences interacting with you. We don't see this with other managers. This is not acceptable and cannot continue. We need to have you turn this around. So that's step number one. Step number two of this conversation is, because they'll deny it, right? They'll say, it's not my fault. My employees are losers. They're not producing. I have to act that way. Your answer to that is, I'm not going to engage in a fact battle with you. I'm not there. I don't work with you. But there is one fact: your behavior is perceived as too abrasive, and that fact has to change. So you're not going to let them deny it. The only fact that really matters is that you've received several complaints. So, you know, you have to step in. Okay, I have a question. Some people see and care for a few weeks and then the cycle begins again. At what point is it reasonable to assume the person is not going to make a permanent change? Love that question. So what happens, and I see this all the time, is somebody has stepped in and had a conversation with this person about their behavior, and that initial conversation, as you're saying, for a few weeks has allowed them to see and care for a little bit, but then they go back into the behavior that they were engaging in. The reason they're falling back into their old ways is lack of self-awareness, and they don't fully understand the damage they're causing, and they don't fully understand, you know, what the consequences are. They just don't have the self-awareness. Someone's asking me to go back to the last slide, so yes, I will do that. So, you know, I coach people who engage in abrasive behaviors or workplace bullies, if you want to call them that, and they do make permanent change. I have 100% success rate with the people I've coached. I use a methodology that was created by a woman who's been using it for 40 years. It works. So if you want to talk more offline about that process, I can absolutely talk with you more. But the reason they're not changing is the lack of self-awareness. So you're missing part of the process. That's why they're not making permanent change. Okay, so then the next part of the conversation is to make them care. So you're going to say, you must change in the following ways, and you're going to give very specific examples. And then you have to give them a consequence. Failure to do so will result in X. So that's how you make people care. So they, at this point in the stage or in the game, they are lacking self-awareness. They don't understand the damage they're causing. The only way to make them care at this point about change is to give them a consequence. So you're working with extrinsic motivation right now at this point. And so it could be that they'll be demoted, they'll be, you know, resources will be taken from them, they'll be fired, whatever it is, they'll be transferred, part of their work will be taken away, whatever it is, there has to be some sort of a consequence. And then from there, you get them help. You can offer internal mentoring or specialized coaching. So internal mentoring is great if this individual has a good relationship with the CEO, for example, get them together and let the CEO teach them. If that's not the case, if you don't have an opportunity to pair them up with a mentor, then you may want to engage them in specialized coaching, which I'll talk about in 1 second. Someone asked me to go back to the previous slide, so I'll do that. And then how do you carry out these changes without buy-in from upper levels? So you do need buy-in, absolutely, from leadership. So we have a few different ways that we're able to help get that buy-in that's needed. For example, talking with the leader about the liability. If this person's allowed to act this way, they're easily crossing into harassment, and that's illegal behavior. What kind of message are you sending? Talking with them about what they want their legacy to be, I find really helps. So a lot of CEOs are focused on the legacy they leave behind. So that's a way to sort of get to them, and talking about the numbers. We've had X turnover because of this person's behavior. We've seen lack of production. These are the things that we've seen, so you can come to them with a cost as well. Let's see. Somebody says, can you email me with more information about coaching? Yes, we will do that. Okay. So let's talk about specialized coaching. So these are my little action figures. Coaching is based on fight or flight. So when I meet with my coachees, my clients, I talk about fight or flight. So I talk with them about how they are making people anxious with the way they're behaving, and it's causing people to either flee or fight them. So fleeing in the workplace means that they're not speaking up in staff meetings. They're going around the individual to avoid them. Fighting means that maybe they all grouped together and went to HR, or they're all sort of speaking up in staff meetings against that person. So all of my coaching is based on this very simple concept that we all know, fight or flight. And so the way my coaching unfolds is asking, what are people anxious about, and how do you help them reduce their anxiety? And so that's the specialized coaching. So something for us to talk about if you want to explore that more. Happy to give more details. All right, action item number 8, implement a healthy workplace policy and show zero tolerance for bad behavior. So a lot of people out there, of course you have to have your harassment policy, but a lot of people out there are saying have an anti-bullying policy too. Sure, you could do that, but we do a healthy workplace policy. So again, kind of going back to my story and how I see the world, the solution for bad behavior is positive behavior. So why focus on the things that you don't want? Focus on the things that you do want. So when we work with clients to implement a policy, the way we do that is we ask employees this one question: how would you like to be treated by your peers and managers? And then we include their answers in the policy. So I do this in a group setting, usually at the end of a training, and then I'll ask the question. I'll give people about 10 minutes to come up with answers in groups, and then collect all of those answers. Look for themes, because usually every group has said the same thing, and then the answers go in the policy. So the policy that we use is an anti-bullying policy, but it's also a healthy workplace policy, and that's the focus of it. So it's here's the behaviors that we're all agreeing to, and then, by the way, here's how bullying is defined, and that's prohibited as well. So focus on the things that you do want rather than on the things that you don't want. Actually, even if you're not going to implement a healthy workplace policy, this is a great exercise to do. I would do it anyways. Take it back and do it at your next staff meeting. What are your thoughts? How are we feeling? Someone says, this is great information. This is very helpful. Empowered. Great idea. Fantastic ideas and direction. I like the exercise. Grateful for the info. All right, perfect. Love the idea of implementing this. Like the policy, the positive policy. Perfect. All right. Action item number 9 is to offer many designated channels for complaints. So you know that already. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, but you need to have HR be open for taking complaints. You need your managers to be open for taking complaints. You need an outside source to be open to take complaints. Someone says, I'd love for you to be my boss, Catherine. Thank you so much. That was very, very sweet. I appreciate that. Having designated channels that people can reach out to will help increase the opportunity for them to file a complaint. So again, if you have a culture where people are afraid to report, you definitely need that outside source. What do I mean by outside source? So there are a ton of hotline companies. You could have somebody have a hotline that you publish a phone number. I'm also aware of a couple organizations that have apps. So there's one app called Stop It Pro. Stop It Pro is a phone app, and their idea was that if you if you have it on your phone, we all have our phones with us, that if I witness something, pretty much right away, I can go to my phone as I'm walking back to my office and, file my complaint right then and there. There's another company called Awarity. Awarity is an online or a computer app, and what they would do is have a little button on your website, and then people can file a complaint there from their computer. Someone asks, is that better to have an outside channel? I think you need to have it. Absolutely. I have noticed as a consultant that people are often much more open and talkative when it's me that they're talking to versus HR. So I think it is important to have an outside channel, and they are very cost effective. All right, last action item, commit to being an example. So, if somebody complains to you about something like workplace bullying and you don't do anything about it, again, you're telling people behavior is irrelevant to you. So you have to step in, you have to be an example and show that this behavior is not something that you're going to tolerate. Obviously, we all have to focus on acting in ways that are positive and respectful at all times. Let's see, someone says, can you list the 10 action steps in a follow-up email? Sure, we can do that. We'll do that in the replay email. Someone says, how do you investigate with an outside channel? So what happens, Anna, is that if you Stop It Pro, for example, you designate who gets the complaint. So we all work together. I go to my Stop It Pro app and I file a complaint about something I saw. You get an email that says a complaint's been filed, and I have the opportunity to file it as an anonymous person, or I can give my information. If I file it as anonymous and I just kind of say, I witnessed something in a staff meeting, you may not be able to do anything with that, just as if someone comes to you and says, I saw this happen, but don't tell anybody about it. You can't do anything with that either, right? So, and same with Awarity. You can designate who gets a copy, who gets an email when a complaint is filed, and then you actually in Awarity, they have a whole database, so that you have a process that you set up inside Awarity, and you check boxes as you go through that process that you've set up. Someone says Stop It Pro is not an iPhone. You go to their website. Stop It Pro is the name of it. Maybe they don't have the app for iPhone yet. I'm not sure. My only challenge is our top executive is the one who lacks self-awareness. Okay, well, something for us to talk about. Let's talk offline. I can give you some tips. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with this, and then we'll open it up for more questions. Addressing negative behavior is a triple win. A negative person is more effective if you address their behavior. People are less anxious and more productive when you're focusing on having a positive culture. And the organization is better protected from liability, and that means that you can sleep at night. So make sure that you focus on culture. It's a good thing, right? So a culture built on respect is your best defense against harassment. If you're talking about harassment prevention, culture is harassment prevention. Training and policy, people call it harassment prevention, but it's not. It's compliance. Nothing bad has ever come out of a positive work environment. So seriously, what are you waiting for? It's time to fix your culture. No more excuses. You owe it to your employees to do this. And so, positive culture prevents harassment. It creates positive, happy work environments where customers are being served well. It has bottom line results. Nothing bad comes out of it. So what I'd love to do, I'm doing something new this time. We're going to do a poll. I'm just curious to know if you got what you need to take action. So I'm going to pull this up and give you a moment to answer it. Did you get what you need to take action? I'll leave it open for a couple more seconds. Get your answers in. I'm still seeing people voting. Okay, all good? Oh, more votes coming in. I see questions coming through while we're doing this. I will answer them. Give me one moment. All right. Closing the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. I got lots of yeses and a few sort of, so that's good. All right. I got one more poll for you. If you want more information from us about any of the things we've talked about today, go ahead and click yes, and we'll be sure to reach out to you. We're happy to talk with you offline about any of the things we've talked about. Ultimately, you know, we are culture consultants. That's what we do here. So happy to work with you. All right, so while that's up, I'll get you some answers to some of these questions. Okay. Someone said, I really appreciate the differentiation between training and policy and needing to focus on culture. Thank you. You are welcome. Good. Someone says, good to know that we were on track, even though it was accidental. Someone says it's relevant in this era. It's important to integrate information about microaggressions and historic trauma experienced by targeted groups. Absolutely. It's important to, you know, all the more reason to do a training in person so you can talk about these things. What do you mean when you say a negative person is more effective under the win? Oh, sorry, I didn't lay it out very clearly in my slide. So what I'm saying is if you address a negative person's behavior, then they become more effective. So for example, if you have a workplace bully and you get them coaching and address their behavior, they'll be as productive as they were before, but they'll be more effective, right? People won't be going around them anymore and avoiding them. So addressing culture and addressing negative behaviors, you know, is a win for them because they'll be more effective. Does that make sense? All right, perfect. All right, so with that, what I will do, let me close that poll. I'll just leave this with you. So Phil is my account strategist. His email address is there. If you do have any other questions, I know some of you had said, yes, you'd like more information, so we'll be reaching out to you if you selected yes there. But Phil's email address is here. By all means, shoot him an email if you have any questions or want to get some time with me. Happy to chat with any of you about any of the things going on. So I'll leave this up and see what kind of questions we have here. So let's have a little Q&A time. Okay, so first question. I know our organizational culture needs a little help, but I don't know where to start. What is a good first step? Whenever I work with clients, the best place to start is with a survey. And so when we do that, we do custom surveys based on the information that we've collected from the stakeholders. And we also do interviews as part of the survey process, which is something internally you might not be able to do because you probably won't get honest answers. But so great first step is to do a survey so that you can understand where you're at now and address the problems in the survey. If that feels too much and you're thinking there's no way my leader will approve something like that, a great first step is to just start doing some of these little activities, these little things. Have the staff meeting where you ask people how they want to be treated. You know, challenge managers to start talking about core values in their staff meetings. So doing things that really drive your core values forward, even if it's just you plugging along, that's a great place to start. Someone asked again, will the slides be available? I've seen that question several times. I don't know. I'm hesitant to give them out, but I know sometimes it's a lot of information. Let me think on it. Let's see. Well, let me think on it. Okay, so would welcome the ability to have a verbal conversation with you. I apologize, I missed your chance to talk with you a few months ago. Yep, absolutely. If you checked yes or send Phil an email, we will get the 15 minutes. You know, when I'm thinking about the slides, just thinking, I've had a couple people try to recreate things that I've done in the past. So that's why I'm so hesitant to do it. I've been seeing people sort of copying what I'm doing. So you'll get the recording. If there's anything that you need at all from the slides that you feel like I really missed this and I really want to make sure I have it, set up an appointment with Phil. He'll elaborate for you, or I will elaborate for you. So if there's anything you feel like you missed, email Phil. Any other questions? Let's see. We just purchased your civility training, but haven't had a chance to look at it. Does it include both employee and manager trainings? Are you talking about the master class, Danielle? The civility training? Yes, you are. Yeah, so the master class actually takes you through culture change. So you've got a whole lot more than just training, but it does have training for managers and supervisors in there. I actually provided some of my slides and workbooks in there. So you are all set for culture change. You've got everything you need in the master class. So glad to hear it. I'll be curious to hear what you think as you're going through it. So by all means, email with me and let me know how it's going. Someone says, would love to get the recording. I want to listen to it again. Yep, so you'll get the recording here a little bit later today, 100%. Let's see, do you offer sexual harassment training? Indeed, I do. I do offer sexual harassment training. So my sexual harassment training is, focused on culture. So you'll get information about what it is in the law and all that good stuff, but a lot of it will be around culture and how to ultimately prevent it. So if you're interested in sexual harassment training, email Phil and he will get that going for you. Is this class approved for credits? And also I see, do we get the certificate? So we have not bothered to go through the HRCI and all that good stuff, but I know that you can still get credits for sort of random courses like this one, and I am an approved speaker. Many things I've done over the last decade have been approved by HRCI and SHRM, so you should have no problem getting this webinar approved. What you need when you go online to do that is the learning objectives, and so you can just copy that from the last email you got from me, or email Phil and he will send those back to you. Any other questions? Any questions on anything we've talked about? Will I be doing this webinar again? Probably not, Connie, but you'll have the recording. You're free to watch it again. You're free to pass it around to whomever you want. It'll be on YouTube. So, feel free to watch it with your other managers. We do trainings pretty regularly, or do webinars regularly. So if you're on my e-newsletter list, you'll get all of that information as it comes out. Any other questions? Any questions about anything we've talked about? Anything about culture? Anything about harassment prevention? You will get the recording later today. Somebody's asking. Okay, someone says, this has been great. Thank you. Awesome. Well, it's been great chatting with you all. I really appreciate your attention, and you probably noticed I'm very passionate about culture. This is what we do at Civility Partners. We love going through this process. It hurts my heart a little bit when I think about employees out there being unhappy. What we do for a living is such a huge part of our self-concept and our self-esteem. So anybody out there who's unhappy is, it's hurting their ability to be the best version of themselves. And that pains me a little bit when I think of that. So good luck. Let me know if you need anything. Somebody says, you make it sound easy. I have been doing this for a long time. So no, culture change is not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. It's work, but it's worth it. And we can make it easier by being there. So reach out to Phil if you want to chat. All right. Thanks all so much. It was a pleasure spending some time with you today. Enjoy the rest of your day.